Hello, I'm Dr. Pierre Simon, and it's great being back with you. We've been in this series of the ABCs of spiritual life. I hope you've enjoyed it. Today we're talking about the letter M. And I prayed and I said, Lord, what do you want us to talk about in this letter M? And I'm looking at all the names starting with the letter M, and I'm thinking, gosh, there's this, there's that, there's some pretty good things, there's some other things, but what do people need to hear right now? What's important for us to hear or get reinforcement regarding? And I looked at this and I realized, there's a lot of this going on and it's increasing, and we can't control it, at least the distribution of it, but we can control what we personally do about it, and that's marijuana. I was an addictions professional instructor in Florida for the state of Florida through the Net Training Institute in Florida. We were the only Christian provider for teaching those courses required for state certification in the state of Florida. And I've learned a lot about addictions through those years of teaching and studying and helping. And it's not a matter of somebody telling you can't do something. It's a matter of doing what's best for you. And that's what we're going to talk about here today as we speak about marijuana. You may think that spiritual life only consists of happy thoughts and pleasantries. I remember when I first became a Christian, it was, it's all going to be wonderful and great and all this, and it was, in the beginning, and everything is great, and there's excitement and there's stimulation, and then you begin to face realities, and you begin to have to work at being a Christian, at developing your Christian personality, at changing the weaknesses that you may have had, changing them into strengths or improving yourself in some way, and through it all becoming more closely identified with God, Christ, our Christian walk, our spiritual walk, becoming a better person. Our spiritual walk also involves self-control. That's when you say no to something that's required of you to resist those unhealthy or sinful temptations. Please don't be afraid of the word sin. All sin is God's way of identifying, if you do this, it's going to be harmful for you, so we're going to identify it as sin. Now, you can use another word if you like. It might be something pleasurable. But if you continue doing that something pleasurable, it's going to harm you or harm someone else. Let's identify that as sin, or call it whatever you would like. The false teachers then come up, okay, that's wrong, or no, we shouldn't have to do that, or we shouldn't have to restrict that, or that's okay, anything's okay. Well, the false teachers of marijuana, the proponents of marijuana, have harmed a lot of young people over the years, and now they're harming young adults, and even older adults are taking up the call for, this is good, there's nothing wrong with it. Well, there is something wrong with it. It is damaging, and we're going to talk about that. Let's make an honest and biblical look at marijuana usage. Marijuana basically is a greenish gray mixture. I'm sure you've all seen it on TV or heard about it or personally experienced it, but it's a greenish gray mixture of dried, shredded leaves and flowers of the cannabis sativa, or the hemp plant, also called on the streets weed, herb, pot, grass, bud, ganja, Mary Jane, and other terms. Some of them you can't speak on in public. Marijuana can be hand rolled into little joints like a cigarette, stuffing stuffing the dried leaves into tobacco pipes or other pipes or water pipe called bongs. Rolling marijuana cigars are called blunts. They even brew it as a tea and mixed into foods like brownies, cookies, and candies. It's important to remember that when mixing it into food, it lessens the strength of the chemical, but you're going to tend to eat more of it. And so it's important to remember that when eating foods or drinking liquids mixed with marijuana, the delayed effects may cause users to consume the THC more than they intended. What's the end result of that? ER visits. Oftentimes I talk with ER staff, nurses, doctors, regarding types of people that come in and things like that. I used to, when I used to work in the psychiatric unit many years ago, I would be called to come down to the ER and evaluate someone as to whether they need to be admitted to the psychiatric unit. And very often you would get someone who had been eating too much marijuana laced food, and it caused severe reactions for them. Well, all kinds of reactions. So what's the big deal? Now I've kind of laid it out for you there, what marijuana is basically. So what's the big deal? Well, the big deal about marijuana is that it contains a psychoactive, mind-altering chemical called delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinoid, more commonly called THC. Easier to say THC. THC is responsible for most of the intoxicating effects sought by recreational marijuana users. Well, what are they not telling us? I listen to the news once in a while now, very rarely compared to the past. But when I do, I'm thinking, what are they not telling us? They have their agenda. They've been given their outline of what to talk about. I remember when I was young, my dad used to watch the news at dinner time every night. So we had the little TV on in the kitchen, and we'd be eating, and the news would be on, and he would be listening to it. And I realized back then, you got a pretty good picture of what was going on around the world in the news. Not today. Today you're getting just what they want you to hear. And I'm thinking, well, what about the rest of the news around the world? What about all this and that's going on? Never hearing anything about those things. Well, because they're telling you what they want you to hear. Well, in the same way, proponents of marijuana are telling you what you want to hear, what they want you to hear. What marijuana advocates leave out of their product labeling is that the plant also contains over 500 other chemicals. 500. Have you ever, you go to the grocery store and you're looking at the boxes, what's in this food here that I'm about to buy? Oh, it's got this, and that, so it's got its little list. Imagine if they put the 500 on the list. Oh my gosh. And 40 out of that 500 are actually toxic to the human body. For example, cyanide. And you also find that in tobacco leaves, including over 100 chemically related THC compounds in the marijuana plant called cannabinoids. Now, cannabinoids, we have receptor sites in our body, but particularly in the brain, that receive cannabinoids. And those receptor sites, as you can see in this image of the brain, it's all over the brain, but often focused right in the middle there. You have the limbic system, and we'll be talking about that in a little bit. And I identify that as the flesh center of our brain. Marijuana is an entry-level product, but the best way to see that is to identify school children. Where does it start? And certainly we can see, exceptions to the rule where it starts in, middle school perhaps and goes on up. But the surveys that have been done, the research has been done, they found it stands out more in the 8th to 12th grades. In 2015, they did a study, and 11.8% of 8th graders reported marijuana use in that past year, and 6.5% were current users after that year. Among the 10th graders, 25.4% had used marijuana in the past year, while 14.8 were current users at the time of the report, at the time they were writing it out and producing it. 12th graders, well, of course, they're the highest. 34.9% had used marijuana during the year before the survey, and 21.3% were current users. 6% said they used marijuana daily or near daily. And those are the ones who just admitted it. Most aren't going to admit it. As a parent, it's our responsibility to watch over our children and protect our children and help our children to grow and mature. But the adverse consequences of marijuana use hinder our kids, hinder us if we're using, from maturing and growing and developing. So among some of the adverse consequences of marijuana use is impaired short-term memory. That's a big one. Impaired attention, judgment, and other cognitive functions. Impaired coordination and balance. Increased heart rate. More and more people are having heart trouble. It seems like these days I'm hearing a lot more from clients with heart troubles that I never heard before. What's the reason? I don't know, but let's protect our hearts. It's the only one we have. Another consequence is anxiety. Anxiety's been on the increase. And of course, a lot more stress out there, and it's going to produce more anxiety, but it's increasing. So why take something that's going to increase it all the more? Paranoia is another consequence of marijuana use. I've heard so many stories of paranoia that have destroyed people's lives and caused them to just grieve deeply for those losses. And there's psychosis also as a consequence for some, not all, but for some. Persistent, lasting longer than intoxication with marijuana use, well, impaired learning and coordination persists after the intoxication. It can persist for days. It can persist for weeks. Sleep problems can persist as well, and it's not just weeks. Sometimes it goes even longer than that. And certainly you don't want to drive, you don't want to operate machinery even after the intoxication, because you're not all there. Long-term cumulative effects or repeated use of marijuana, it has the potential for addiction. When I was younger, they said, oh, you can't be addicted to marijuana. Well, they've changed their tune on that over the years, and recognizing that, yes, it's true that they are meeting the criteria for addiction among those who have been abusing marijuana for some time. And there is withdrawal effects that occur. I used to work in a psychiatric unit when I started off in counseling, as I was working on my master's degree and my PhD later. And you saw these adolescents coming into the adolescent unit withdrawing from marijuana because they'd been dependent on it. And we were saying at the time, this was 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we were saying, this is an addiction, but the researchers were saying, oh, no, it's not an addiction. Impairments in learning and memory with potential loss of IQ. Yeah, you can lose your IQ. Your IQ can drop from any addiction, but particularly from marijuana because it affects those centers of memory and intelligence so much it affects them. Increased risk of chronic cough and bronchitis. So many people today are getting a cold, and the cold is turning into pneumonia for whatever reasons. Do you want to add to that? You want to make that worse? Well, use marijuana and it will increase, it will make it worse for you. Increased risk of other drug and alcohol use disorders. So it is an entry-level drug, or considered that to be an entry-level drug. Increased risk of schizophrenia in people with genetic vulnerability. Now, that doesn't mean somebody's going to become schizophrenic because they're smoking weed. But what it does mean is if that gene is inside a person because they inherited from generations past from someone or several family members may have had mental illness in the past, that doesn't mean that schizophrenic gene is going to activate in that person's lifetime. But when you do certain things that will trigger activation of a gene, then you're going to get whatever that is that gene is holding on to and now releasing into your system. Marijuana is one of those products that can trigger that activation in genes that are inactive. I was reading a report, was telling us some more about the marijuana research, and it says, consequently, someone who smokes marijuana daily may be functioning at a reduced intellectual level most or all of the time. Considerable evidence suggests that students who smoke marijuana have poor educational outcomes. Poor educational outcomes. Are you allowing your kids to smoke because maybe you smoke? Or are you not monitoring the parties they're going to, or the friend's house that they're visiting? Is that what you want for your child, for your youth, or even for yourself? Poor educational outcomes? Then they're non-smoking peers. Smokers, non-smokers. Smokers have poorer educational outcomes than non-smokers. For example, a review of 48 relevant studies found marijuana use to be associated with reduced educational attainment. In other words, reduced chances of graduating. So often, I would see students, college students even, coming in after that first semester or second semester of college, who were honor students in high school, very intelligent, and they failed. They failed their classes, they were kicked out of college, or they're on suspension in college. Okay, well, the parents say, well, what's happening? Don't know what do they're partying too much or whatever, what is it? We need to find out. Come to find out, the simple solution, and most of the time, was they were smoking marijuana. They were using it when they shouldn't have been. They were using it too much. It took away their intelligence, their motivation, their desire to do well in school. No word in the Bible describes marijuana. The word marijuana is not found in the Bible, but we can find its sister in alcohol. Alcohol is mentioned in the Bible, and like alcohol, we can identify the use of marijuana for recreational purposes as gratifying the desires of the flesh. To have a desire, having a strong feeling of wanting to have something or wishing for something to happen, is a desire. The Bible tells us, but I say, walk by the Spirit, that's the Spirit of God, and you'll not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit of God, and the desires of the Spirit of God are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things you want to do. What do we want to do? We want to do things that are fun, pleasurable, things that we enjoy, and there are things that we can do in those categories that are not sinful or harmful to us, but these things that it's referring to are those things that are harmful to us that we enjoy. But if you want to be led by the Spirit of God, you're not under the law. Now, the works of the flesh are evident: sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, so we'll put marijuana in that category, orgies, and things of these kind. I warn you, as I warned before, the Bible goes on to say, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Well, certainly, if you're not a Christian and you're doing those things, you're in a place where you can't quite make that intellectual decision to receive God, to believe and change your life. And that's because we're in that part of the brain that's not a good part of the brain, in that pleasure part of the brain. Think of it this way, and I've spoken about this in the past. Think of the brain as two halves. The top part of the brain represents all that's good about human nature: reasoning, logic, problem solving, conscience, and spirituality. That's the upper room, I call. That's the upper part of the brain where all the good stuff is located in our minds. God's Spirit communicates through our spirit from God dimension into the third dimension where we dwell. So we're all in this third dimension. I don't know what dimension God's in. We could call it the fourth dimension, or the dimension of light. We could call it the eighth dimension, or whatever. They've identified something like 11 or more dimensions. I don't know how they can identify all that, but with that string theory, that's what they're coming up with, as there are multiple dimensions. So where do we put God in those dimensions? Because he can pass through all those dimensions, and if he's capable of going through all those dimensions, all right, then he must be up above in the very top of those dimensions. So we'll call it the God dimension. That God dimension within us and all around us. In theology, the spirit, our spirit, is considered the incorporeal part of a person, which leaves at death. Just as we stop breathing, our spirit leaves. The basement image of the flesh is what I'm talking about when I'm saying you're stuck in a place. If you've never received God, you're not going to be able to understand, or you're going to have a whole lot of trouble stuck in that place and being able to make those changes you need to make in your life. In the Bible, the flesh is synonymous with sinful nature. So the Bible might call it natural man, old nature, or old man. The flesh represents the human being's fallen state of mind, all that is potentially evil or harmful, in which desires significantly reduce the extent or quantity of reason, logic, spirituality. It's reduced when you're in the basement of the mind. Within the basement resides the flesh center. I identify as the limbic system, and perhaps a few other little organs around it of your body. The limbic system contains thoughts of human limitation, both intellectually and morally. The Bible tells us, "For I know that nothing good lives in me, that is, in my flesh, my human nature, my worldliness, my sinful capacity, for the willingness to do good is present in me, but the doing of good is not." That happens a lot, doesn't it? Well, I don't want to eat that dessert. I shouldn't eat that dessert, well, maybe a little bite, oh, whoops, now you feel bad, then you got to finish it, of course, because it would be wasting if you didn't finish it. The brain's limbic system is the heart of our brain's flesh center, where our fight or flight center operates. The flesh is a type of Frankenstein machine feeding on the fuel of dissatisfaction, insecurity, and insignificance. Once turned on, the flesh machine generates thoughts and feelings of self-protection, selfishness, distrust, entitlement, control, rigidity, dysfunction, anger, anxiety, negativity, criticism, fear, objections, addictions, depression, and hostility towards self and others. Wow. All that's turned on in the limbic system, in the fear center, in the flesh center of our brain. Well, when that gets turned on, how are you going to think good thoughts? How are you going to think God thoughts? How are you going to think right thinking, good thinking? It's up here in the upper part, and you're stuck down there with all that negativity down there in the basement of the brain. Within the basement of our mind, the flesh is incapable of knowing God without special revelation. In other words, special God intervention to help us, and the redemption that lifts us out of that basement center back into the upper room. An act of God. In other words, sometimes that's the only way to get out when we're so encrusted in that negativity of the basement area. Marijuana does that. Drugs do that. Alcohol does that. I'm not saying you can't have a drink, but the Bible says drink moderately if you have a drink. Don't drink to intoxication. Don't use drugs to intoxication, whether it's a medical drug or something else. And in the same way, marijuana does have the THC, the product of marijuana may have some medical benefits when used properly and when it's made properly, but you have to be careful still. The Bible tells us the natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God. The natural person that it's referring to there is that person of the flesh within you, within that limbic system, within that very functioning of that Frankenstein machinery that's generating all of that angst inside of you. For they are folly to him, and he is not able to understand them because they're spiritually discerned. What is that telling us? You can't spiritually discern when you're stuck in the basement of your brain, the basement of your mind. You're down in that basement, the door's closed, God's up here. God is communicating through that God dimension within us to our spirit, which is within that God dimension as well, I believe. We can hear him up there. It's hard, if not impossible, to hear him down there. And he's not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. I need to be up here to be spiritual, to have that ability to spiritually discern things. Well, guess what? Marijuana is a choice. Alcohol is a choice. Doing harmful things is a choice. We can't blame Eve as Adam did. We can't blame Adam. We can't blame our wives, our husbands, our friends, our co-workers. We can't blame anybody. It's a choice. Marijuana use, abuse, dependency, or addiction is a person's choice. The Bible tells us everything is permissible for me, but not all things are beneficial. Everything is permissible for me, but I'll not be enslaved by anything and brought under its power, allowing it to control me. Be wise. If you find yourself in the basement of negativity, if you find yourself drowning in upset or depression or anxiety or whatever it may be, reach out, get help to pull you out of that basement into the upper room where you can have more self-control, where you can think more clearly and be able to make those good decisions that are lasting decisions, doing good for you throughout your life. I hope this was helpful for you. If you got something out of this, please press that like button and press the bell if you'd like to get notified. I have a PDF on all of my videos. This video in particular was a long one. The PDF has a lot more material in it. I had to cut it short in doing the PowerPoint. So if you want to read more material about what I've been speaking of here, request that PDF. Or if you've signed up to receive the newsletter from our website, it'll automatically come out to you. And please remember that at New Horizons Institute of Counseling, we're for healing, peace, and harmony. God bless. We'll talk to you next time.